that is about our institutions in the United States. And the reason is that so much of what we know about our institutions and so much of what we know about what our institutions do on a day-to-day basis um, gets filtered through the media. Very few of us have the time to go to Washington, D.C., to actually sit inside of hearings in Congress or meet with administration officials or listen to Supreme Court cases. The bulk of what we get is filtered. And that filter presents us some issues, as we'll see. And it also has to do with the idea that our institutions could be doing well, but we might not be hearing about it. Or they could be doing poorly and we might not be hearing about it. And that goes back to the legitimacy of the institutions themselves. So, spending a week on the media is a worthwhile enterprise in this class for those reasons. When we talk about the media, it's important to understand kind of an overview of what the media means in terms of political coverage. So, I have heard many people say in the past year or so that our media has never been worse, that we are so polarized, and that media outlets are, ringers for one side or the other, and it's never been this way before. In fact, that's actually kind of embedded in our history. The parties actually had their own newspapers at the start of our country. Once we got parties, which was pretty quickly, despite the fact that our founders did not want them, um, we started to have partisan newspapers printing material that was favorable to the parties and that controlled them. And in fact, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were an attempt to shut down the press of the opposition party. So, this idea that partisan politics has never meshed before with the media is just not true. And in fact, what probably is more of the aberration is the past 50 to 75 years prior to the 21st century, rather than anything that we're seeing now in terms of partisanship. But what we do see is that the format of the media changing has an effect on partisanship being involved. So technology improves the diversity of print. We have the printing press, the growth of the availability of the printing press and the technology required to print newspapers makes it more affordable to have a printing press, and therefore more lucrative to be in the business of printing newspapers, so more people get into it. Now, obviously, this is stymied somewhat by the Civil War, but after the Civil War, we see the growth of the independent media, an era of newspaper investigations. Some of you have probably heard the term muckrakers. These were journalists that worked on investigative pieces to expose corruption in various industries and scandal in political worlds. So we see that grow and grow. And in the 20th century, what we get is the growth of media conglomerates. And the reason why this happens is not singular, but when you have the introduction of new media, radio at first, then television, and then moving into the internet and beyond, um, the availability of what people can own and the cost of ownership changes. The calculations change. So we see that with the introduction of radio, the popularity of TV, that newspaper readership declines. And in fact, outside of the aberration of the post-Trump election world, newspaper readership has been in a decline since the 1980s. Donald Trump is fond of calling the New York Times failing. They're actually doing quite well now, and always will do probably better than other papers because of their prominence in American society. But some of that might be the heed for what one of our authors calls general interest intermediaries. But steadily, newspaper readership goes down, and the reliance on other forms of media goes up. So when we are talking about media today, we're talking about a multitude of sources, and receiving those sources through varying mechanisms, varying sensory mechanisms on an individual level. We have print media with newspapers and magazines. We have television, but even there that varies from network television to cable television and different types of cable television and in terms of cable news. Or are people getting their news from somewhere else? Are they getting it from the Comedy Central shows? Are they getting it from John Oliver and so on? There are people who still listen to radio and talk radio and news radio, and whether that's NPR or a station like WJR in Detroit or other talk radio stations, that varies. And then we have what has been labeled new media, which largely means the internet, but not exclusively, because we have things like podcasts and satellite radio that open up the availability of topics that might not be discussed on terrestrial radio. The availability of people to access media through their mobile devices and applications rather than having to go out to the World Wide Web and search for them, they now have an app that pops up. And the use of social media both as a way to search for news and as a filtering device. All of these sources are used differently by different people, and these things vary on age, race, geography, gender, education level, but what we tend to see is that age is the greatest factor in this. So I'm going to show you a few slides to kind of give you a picture of what the media diet looks like from generation to generation. So if you look at, and these numbers were from 2013, so they went through 2012, but the trends tend to track. The popularity of news sources for people between 67 and 84 years old is predictably heavily new television and newspaper based. The radio plays some role, but not nearly as much as television and newspaper. And the internet plays a fairly small role, and one that, although it's growing, is probably not going to overtake newspaper or television anytime soon. If we step down one level, we see that television is far more influential than newspapers. And in fact, newspapers are now tied neck and neck with the internet and radio. So people are still at this age group tending to find television to be most influential, but that secondary news source, that secondary media source, varies and might just be evenly split. When we get into what is called Generation X, 33 to 47-year-olds, so now this would be about 4 years older, so 37-year-olds to 51-year-olds area, television is still the highest. However, the internet has now become essentially tied with that. And in fact, if you break this group down smaller, what you start to see as you inch down as the internet use goes up significantly. So internet is now the secondary source and for many people the primary source of information. And millennials, 18 to 31-year-olds as of 2013, and again, these trends track as we move forward in time, television is now a secondary source, whereas internet is a primary source. And that shift is fairly recent. That happened after 2010. And in large part, for those of us who remember prior to 2010, it was hard. It was clunky. Prior to, 2005, it was clunky to get your news on the internet. What you got was essentially a watered down version of what you could see on the newsstand, and that's just not the case anymore. So as these news sources change, their use changes, but that is very generational. It is not uniform across all generations and age groups. And so, well, that one got put at the end here. We can actually compare this a little bit from one to the other. If we look here, internet is at 43%. Well, there's no way that is ever going to get to the same prominence. And what that might mean for people is that the popularity of news sources might affect how people perceive the news itself. And social media has certainly changed this. These are both from the Pew Research Center from 2016. About 6 in 10 Americans, about 60% of Americans, get their news from social media, at least in some point. And if you look at that pie chart, um, that can be broken down. So there's 38% of people that say, I never get my news from social media. But 62% actually do get their news from social media. And that means varying things. For some people, that's hardly ever. Sometimes that's, once in a while. But 18% of the people surveyed who are adults get their news through social media. And one of our readings this week points out why this might be so problematic. In fact, both of them do, but in varying ways. And when we couple that with the next graphic, that becomes somewhat starker. When people use social media to get their news, usually they only use one social media site to get their news. And that means if people want to be on Facebook, that's where they're going to get their news. They're not going to go to another social media site and go on Twitter and see what Twitter's saying and go to Reddit and see what they're saying. Usually that means your primary social media source is your only social media source. So 64% of the people who get news on social media get it from one source. And only 26% of the people get it from two sources and only 10 from three or more sources. So we have some long-standing problems with media and politics that need to now be discussed in terms of what we know about who uses what media. And some of these problems were problems that have always been part of our political and media landscape, but now have morphed a little bit because of the media involved. And some are, newer and more germane to what we do now. The first of these is the idea of credibility. And what credibility means is answering in the affirmative the following question: can you trust the facts that you are receiving from a particular news source? And, can you distinguish, or can you trust that they have appropriately distinguished fact from opinion? So that when you're reading something, am I reading news? Am I reading opinion? There are other problems that come under the umbrella of biases. And biases generally means that there are factors that play into the coverage that is presented of various news items. And there are different types of biases. Story selection bias has to do with the idea of newsworthiness. The idea that what is newsworthy might vary from station to station on TV and from source to source on media as a whole. So this might have to do with news cycles, that once something is old news, it's no longer newsworthy and therefore no longer covered anymore. And this also might have to do with the media's ability and each media source's ability to synthesize information into the format that they use. So not all stories can be covered in the typical media format. Some are far too complex and mundane for the typical 30 minutes you may get of a viewer during the evening news. So they're either given light treatment in terms of story selection, so you might hear about it but not in depth, or the news might gloss over them or ignore them entirely. So story selection bias is the idea of what is newsworthy. Ideological bias is the idea that the bias of either the writers, the reporters, the editors, or the owners of the media, that their ideological viewpoints are somehow shifting the coverage of the news. So the question is often asked, as an accusation mostly, whether the media has a liberal bias. And some people might claim that the media has a conservative one. And there is this kernel of truth behind that. Journalists tend to be on the whole more liberal, and publishers tend to be on the whole more conservative. Publishers have more money, journalists have less money. It kind of tracks what we know about income and education. But this doesn't necessarily balance out. And so we know that our news sources might have ideological bias issues. And it's important for people who are consumers of news to understand that when they're reading a story, that might be influenced by these biases. One other type of bias is the professional bias. And the professional bias is really a bias that goes against in depth coverage. Journalists are typically generalists. They are often not specialists in the subjects that they cover, even when they have years of experience in politics. That's applied political experience. It's not an in depth political or legal knowledge most of the time. And they operate on tight deadlines. They have to turn things around quickly, and therefore they have to rely on the experts who are available to talk with them at any given point in time, and their interpretation, which might be limited, might cloud the story. So now, having been interviewed for news stories as a so called expert, which I kind of always laugh at, it's always interesting to see how my quotes are used in stories down the road. And what I have noticed is that I usually have to be careful to provide the context within a quotable piece of information, because sometimes it's not easy for journalists to discern what I mean by something. So I usually have to couch what I mean in terms that can be understood by a wider group of people. So they might be seeking out expert opinions, but they might not always be able to discern what the expert actually means. And this varies from news source to news source. Media control and who owns the media source. This actually matters, and it matters more and more, and we'll talk about this in a second. But generally, the idea is that there are fewer ownership points in the news and in the media, and those points of connection, when we have conglomerates, might provide problematic areas for unbiased coverage. Then there is the problem with political coverage in general, which I think after an election year we can all comfortably say we have experienced. Political coverage tends to be a cult of personality. We are obsessed with personalities, and we're obsessed with scandals. If it doesn't involve a personality or a scandal, it does not lead the evening news. It is much harder to get news sources to cover policy matters over the horse race coverage of an election. Who's winning, who's losing, who's poised to overtake in the polls, who's lost in the polls. That type of thing is really, really easy for people to focus on, even the media. And the idea of agenda setting and framing, which we'll talk about in more depth in a second, adds another layer to this, wherein the media is actually setting up the relevant questions to ask, not the public using the media as a filter. And then we have the issue of media literacy. And I am going to give you some tips on media literacy in a little bit here. So, breaking down some of this. This is a large graphic. I'm actually going to post the link to the whole graphic so you can enlarge it and move around it, of who owns the media. So actually this was done by a graphic artist who talks about the ways in which various media is owned by the same companies. And people don't always realize this. You tend to realize this around times like March Madness, because all of a sudden you have a group of stations that are taken over by basketball games that you didn't know were even related, like True TV and TNT and TBS and CBS. How in the world are they all related? Well, they're all part of the same conglomerate, or they have relationships. And so you can see that there are not many independent sources of news. You can see a few standing out there. PBS tends to stand alone. Vice is somewhat alone, but they have relationships with other media. So generally speaking, you're usually going to have some connection to a couple of things. One is a conglomerate of sorts, and within that conglomerate, you're going to have a connection to people who produce movies, people who produce products, people who have cable television stations, internet presence, the whole gamut of things. And that might mean that what gets covered and how it gets covered varies from place to place. So, for example, it's not just Fox News that won't cover certain things because they don't want to denigrate Republicans, and it's not just MSNBC that will only cover certain things because they want to uplift Democrats. It's this idea that they're connected to themselves. And so a scandal that might involve part of their conglomerate cannot be adequately reported on from that company. If you watch, for example, the NBC Evening News sometimes, they will slip in, almost in passing, that if they're doing a story on a company that's affiliated, same thing for ABC, they'll slip in, Universal, which is owned by Comcast NBC, and then they go into a whole spiel about what the story is, and you kind of miss it for a second that they're actually connected companies. Now, this doesn't mean that that always affects the news source and you can't trust it at all. What it does mean is you need to take it with a grain of salt. So it's important to understand these things and these relationships as you move forward as a consumer of news, but also as someone who needs to understand the media landscape for politics in general. One of those issues involves framing. And framing is something that I personally study in my research. Framing is the idea that information does not exist necessarily on its own, but rather that the way in which information is conveyed can tell a story and can influence a person's perception of the information itself. So if you take a fact, there was a hospital that burned down in Baghdad. Depending on how that fact is delivered, that fact might change. ISIS burned down the hospital. The hospital was burned down by ISIS. You flip it right there. It's the same information, and already you're setting a different tone. But frames can also be much more complex than that. So if you think of a current event or a recent event, you can usually frame it at least two different ways, but often multiple different ways. So I believe in 2015, we had someone who went into a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs and shot and killed 4 people and injured many others. Depending on how you view Planned Parenthood and guns and domestic terrorism, that shifted how people talked about the news story. So, some people referred to it as the Planned Parenthood shooting, whereas others would talk about it as the Colorado Springs shooting. Right there, you're making a decision based on your view of the world, which has to do with the content. If you talk about the issue of terrorists entering the country, you're probably not going to be sympathetic to a frame that says that we're talking about Syrian refugees. So usually the framing conveys its own message along with the content. And framing can shape our policy, which is what I research, that policy preferences and what actually takes hold might actually be changed by how the media and individuals talk about the policy. It certainly shapes our political discourse, and our public opinion can change on a fact that does not change based on the way people talk about it. So there are different types of framing effects. There are equivalency frames. You can frame someone as having a glass half full or a glass half empty. That's your fundamental equivalency frame. It's the same amount of information, same amount of liquid in the glass, different way of conveying it. Priming and framing. So priming works to set you up for how you're going to accept information. So if we go back to the issue of Syrian refugees, if we're talking about terrorism for 15 minutes and then we bring into this discussion the idea that people might use refugee status to get into the United States to commit acts of terrorism, we have now primed you to feel a certain way about that particular issue. There are also frames that reference gender, race, ethnicity, religion, all of those things people tend to have sort of knee-jerk reactions to, and frames can play off of those. And then, of course, there are partisan frames. And partisan frames view issues on a partisan basis. So Democrats view certain keywords as being inherently Republican and inherently bad. So a Democrat, a true partisan Democrat, hears something like balanced budget, and that, prior to the 1990s would always kind of perk up people's ears as something that might be a code word for cutting social programs. Likewise, if you start to talk about things like the National Park Service as a social program rather as something fundamental to our country's infrastructure, you're going to set up a partisan frame that allows people to call in to play their own political leanings. So, all of this means that you have to be a savvy consumer of media in order to navigate this world. And so our readings are going to talk about, the ways in which this world has kind of played itself out. But if I'm going to arm you with anything as individual citizens, aside from our discussion of how this affects our institutions, I think that's a worthwhile enterprise. So I tell this to all of my students, all the way from American government all the way up to graduate classes. The system only works if we evaluate the information that we receive. And we need to know how to evaluate it. Know your main sources. Know what you trust. Know what has given you bad information in the past. And try to have a varied media diet. And what I mean by that is, expose yourself to media you might not like. If you are more progressive, it might not be a bad idea to get the Wall Street Journal in your news feed somehow. Likewise, if you're more conservative, it might not be that bad to get the Washington Post or, the Atlantic in your news feed. But there are other things. Know what is satire. I often have to tell people The Onion is satire. It is not real. Look up a story about Kim Jong-un being voted sexiest man alive and China's response to that a few years ago, and you'll understand that there are many places in the world that don't know that The Onion is satire. But there are many other sites that are satire now. And there are far too many to list here because they keep popping up every day. There's a difference between fake news and satire. Fake news is trying to actually get you to believe something in order to change your opinions. Satire is trying to play off of an idea to get you to look at the world in a different way. So satire uses humor in some way to kind of change your viewpoint on a situation in a way that is usually funny. Sometimes it misses the mark. But portrays something in a different light that you might not have seen before. And it's a new way to view something. Whereas fake news is just bad information. Fake news is Hillary Clinton is running a child sex ring out of a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. That's fake news. Satire is Kim Jong-un is the sexiest man alive, playing off the idea that not only is he not sexy, but maybe the whole enterprise of engaging in who is the sexiest man alive might not be so worthwhile after all. So there's satire, there's also bad analysis. Some people get the facts right, but the analysis is wrong. So know your trusted sources, know who has partisan leanings, and then know your sources for fact-checking. Places like Snopes.com, factcheck.org, and my personal favorite, politifact.org, are great places to check up on a story and on what something a politician says and how it rates in terms of being true or false or somewhere in between. But most of all, sharpen your instincts, but trust them. If you see a story that is too bad or too good to be true, odds are it probably is. So actually read the story, don't just share it without reading it, and click the links. Figure out if it's true or not. Use the intellect that you have. We know that for 2016 this was a large problem, and this is heading into one of your readings. This idea of fake news was a problem because producers of fake news found out how to game the algorithms on social media, particularly on Facebook, in order to make it so that fake news stories were showing up more than mainstream news stories. And by time Election Day came around, fake news was more popular on Facebook, which, by the way, is the heaviest news-sourced choice for people who do get their news on social media. So fake news was showing up more than mainstream news. And so the BuzzFeed report came away with a few key things that I wanted to talk about. If you look at the difference in fake election stories versus mainstream election stories by Facebook engagement, so engagement, as it says there, is not just how many people saw it, but how many clicked on it, shared, reacted, commented, etc. The fake news stories have a few things that should be kind of clued in right away. First of all, is that their sources are particularly untrustworthy. They're at best biased, and at worst, you've never heard of them before. Their headlines tend to be kind of fantastical in a way that you should automatically kind of perk up about rather than just sharing it. Um, and what we tend to find out, and I don't think we totally realized this before 2016, is that sharing a story to point out how ridiculous it is actually helps that story gain traction on Facebook. So screenshot it and share the screenshot, but don't share the actual story. But when you look at the mainstream election stories, most of them are, I don't know, tamer. I would take the Melania Trump's girl-on-girl photos from Racy photo shoot revealed out of there, but that's a New York Post. What are you going to do? They have sources that you've heard of before, and so they're not likely to be as noticeable, and so they're probably not going to get the traction that the fake election stories get. And we found out through that BuzzFeed report that this plays off of partisanship. So this goes back to our framing issues and to our media literacy issues. And this has a key component for our course in it, which is if our institutions are so driven by this polarization that has happened between parties and between individuals and the citizenry at large, and if fake news is spreading on a partisan basis, then how are we to remediate this problem in order to gain trust in both the news and in government again? It kind of presents itself as a chicken and egg problem, and I'm not suggesting that there's an easy solution. But when you start to look away from mainstream news sources, what you see is left or right, and this cuts off the bottom, but you have the whole article, left or right, that there tends to be a greater chance for error. And whether that's mostly false or a mix of true and false, both left and right have problems with presenting false news. And that is a problem because these are the stories that are getting shared. These are the ones that are gathering traction. And people aren't checking these news sources. And this leads us, in many ways, to these echo chambers in the future. One thing I wanted to point out was this Stanford study, which is going to sound fairly familiar when we get to Cass Sunstein's article. The Stanford study studied high schoolers and middle schoolers and their responses to news stories and ads. More than 80% of middle schoolers could not differentiate a sponsored ad from an actual news article. Why is this important? Well, if you have ever heard the phrase, oh, young kids, they understand the internet better, that might not actually be true, because what we're finding out is they don't necessarily have the same grounding sensibilities and same kind of distrust for the first thing they see that we might have had growing up. Certainly, as you get older, people distrust what they see on the internet to differing degrees. Most high schoolers accept photographs presented without verifying them, and so specifically they talk about those photographs you'll see at the end of a news article that are actually ads, and they'll show you something weird. And they'll be like, click here to see the plants growing on Mars, and you click there and the article has nothing to do about it. It's a complete bogus site. But instead of actually clicking through and figuring all that out, most high schoolers will just accept the photograph as truth and then kind of implant it into their memory as a true item. Only a quarter of high school students knew what the blue check mark meant on a news story, or on a news source on Facebook or on Twitter, meaning that it's a verified page. And so when they were confronted with the fact that most of what they were being showed was fake news, there was still 30% of them that argued that the fake news source was better than the actual news source. So we have a long way to go on this verified page issue as well. Most college students don't suspect potential bias in tweets from activist groups. I have encountered this quite a bit in grading papers, though not as much in this class with your blogs, so I will commend you on that. And over half of college students couldn't tell the difference between a real academic organization and a fake one. And in particular, there are organizations that will present themselves as having the same qualifications. There's a pediatrics group that models itself after the American Academy of Pediatrics, which gives out information that is not based in science and research. And yet people see that they have some sort of title and say, oh, well, that's a good group, thinking that that's actually the American Academy of Pediatrics. I will post on our page a working list of false news sources that a communications professor has put together. It's a pretty good list in that it not only tells you when something is just generally a bad news source, but tells you, is it misleading? Is it blatantly false? Is it trying to be clickbaity in some way? The headline means something different than the story, or is it satirical? So it's a really good reference for you to have in general. So let's wrap this back around. And the best way to do that is through the Cass Sunstein piece. Cass Sunstein is a legal and political scholar who, in this is part of a longer piece that he wrote, or longer work. This is directly on point in that he is talking about the ways in which our media landscape, the idea that the consumer should be in charge of picking everything he or she sees, that this is problematic for government and for the republic as a whole. So we're wrapping ourselves right back around to that first question, and the one that you'll face in the final paper, which is, are institutions enough to stand the test of time? Well, Sunstein points out that our media might be playing in this as well. And the problem here is one of consumer choice in media and the citizen and the republic. So let's break this down a little bit. He talks about the problematic power of filtering. What he means by filtering is we now have, at the time it wasn't a robust way, but we knew this was coming, a way to subscribe essentially to news stories, whether that's an RSS feed or some other methodology, an email list, what have you. We have the ability to get news sources that are so filtered that we are not confronted with anything that goes against our preconceived notions. And this filtering is based on the idea that we are all entitled to free speech and free expression, and that's the highest of our possible goals in this country. And he says that a well-functioning system of free expression is not just that we're stopping people, that we're not, rather, stopping people from speaking, or the absence of restraints on free speech, but that there is actually an exposure to greater speech. So a well-functioning system, he says, requires two things. The first is exposure to materials not pre-vetted by the individual. You have to, in other words, make sure that people are being exposed to a wide variety of things, and that means news sources, but it also means entertainment. It means a variety of things that they might not otherwise encounter in a perfectly filtered world. And then he says that we have to have a range of common experiences amongst individuals. At times he calls them our street corners. That part of the reason we no longer have the ability to engage in discourse is because we lack these common experiences. And the few times we get them, the Super Bowl, maybe now and again the presidential debates and the general election, things like that, they're often fleeting, and they're not enough to fix the problems that he sees. So we lack kind of these events where we can come together in some way. We lack a way to avoid the filter and somehow have a common experience with people we might not agree with. So what we have seen is an increase in the available options of news sources and a decrease in what he calls general interest intermediaries. These large, you know, intermediaries that serve to give us a varied diet of information, whether that means having to watch the evening news or read a whole newspaper to get all the stories. We no longer have to do that. And he says, in a world with perfect filtering, without these intermediaries, without these common experiences, we're going to have three major problems. And this is what leads us back to our institutions. The first is fragmentation. He says groups will only talk or listen to members of their own groups and will not be able to form any points of commonality with non-group members. In other words, we're going to create polarized situations where we distrust one another based on group membership, and we might even hate one another based on group membership. And here he's not necessarily talking about demographic groups, though he talks about how that plays into the filtering. But this is ideological fragmentation. Two is lack of shared information. And here he's not even talking about experiences, but he could very well be talking about information that the house next door is burning down. In a world with perfectly tailored individual interests, people will not be exposed to basic information at the same time and in the same ways. So we'll have too few solidarity goods. And he calls these experiences that people share in common, like a presidential debate, the Super Bowl, etc. When without these solidarity goods, we don't necessarily have equal ways to digest what we're seeing. So without being told that the house next to us is burning down because we filtered information, not to receive that, we might not know how to protect ourselves. And we might not know that our neighbors are in danger. So this lack of shared information, these lack of solidarity goods, are real problems. And then finally he says that all of this results in the misunderstanding of freedom as perfect choice. And so the proponents of perfect filtering say, well, the individual should be able to choose, that it's a good thing to make information shortcuts. And he says that, that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, freedom requires knowledge of what you're choosing from. In order to filter, you need to understand what's out there that you're filtering out. And if all you have is the filtered information, you were treating people like consumers instead of actual citizens. And so citizens who are being treated like consumers are going to be told they can never do wrong. And people actually have to be exposed to the idea that they might be wrong to be good citizens. They might have to be exposed to a great deal of things that they find discomforting or that they disagree with in the end. Because stepping outside of that comfort zone is where we actually do the good work of politics and government. And that this actually filters both up and down, from citizens to our institutions and back down again. So the idea is that this isn't just a problem among citizens and the elites have it figured out. Instead, this is a problem among citizens that is kind of a feedback loop between the elites and the citizenry in a way that needs remediation. Otherwise, the project of the American government might be a failure. What you see on the right there is a screenshot from a skit that SNL did, I think it was last fall, right after the election, about the bubble. And it's a liberal bubble. There's a lot after the election about the idea that liberals live in bubbles, and that's why they didn't see the possibility of Trump. Being that it's only one of many bubbles, I will say that it's a worthwhile thing to watch, and I will post it in the comments. So in many ways, we end up right back where we started. We are asking ourselves again the question of whether our institutions can stand the test of time. And to fully answer that question, we had to go through everything that we've done here today, as well as everything we've done for the past semester. We've had to dissect these institutions and their development. We've had to talk about things like federalism, ideology, parties, and media to understand how those institutions got to where they are, and whether that actually fits the description that they were given at the outset. Now, one thing we know is that the description might have been wrong. Just because the founders said something does not mean it's perfect. Let us not forget that the founders were okay with kind of glossing over the idea of slavery, at least for a couple of decades to get a country started. So it's certainly not the case that our founders are infallible. That said, there is some sort of structure that we have been given that has lasted longer than anything else like it in modern history. Is that structure worth saving? And do we have what it takes to save it? Do our institutions have what it takes to meet the challenges of the 21st century and beyond? Or are they so broken down that they don't serve their needs? Remember, at a fundamental level, Congress is supposed to represent our interests. The president is supposed to administer the laws and execute the laws in a way that is congruent with what Congress says, but offers a check and balance on that. And the judiciary is supposed to adjudicate disputes and, as was said in Marbury versus Madison, tell us what the law is, what the Constitution is. At the heart of the question that we have asked for the final paper is this idea that maybe our institutions aren't living up to that. So with that said, what I want you to do with the final paper is take all of this information that you've gathered this semester and come up with one comprehensive document that answers that question. We set out with a very complex but yet simple question. Is everything going to fall apart? Now you have to answer that question. You have to do so methodically. There is no, like I said, one right way to do this. You can get creative. You can do this in terms of a grading mechanism. You can grade each institution A, B, C, D, E, F, making sure, of course, that you give me the analysis of why you're doing that, not just grading them. Don't give everybody an A and go home. Likewise, don't give everybody an F and go home. You have to actually talk about it. You can do it as a report to maybe an interested congressperson who wants to initiate a constitutional convention. You can do it as a straightforward analytical essay talking about the question and developing a line of thought based on our readings and lectures and your blog posts that bring you to an answer to that question. At the end of the day, the structure is only as important as it is for your individual paper. The structure just needs to give you a way to answer the question. You do need to cite to at least 10 of our readings, and that's 10 not including the 3 that actually talk about the question. So that includes Iglesias, Edwards, and Meyerson. Those are automatically included. You have to talk about them. The 10 can be anything else from the syllabus, including the 2 we've talked about today, or, what have you. One Federalist paper is one source, so I guess if you want to use all 3 or 4 that we've talked about, feel free, but have a purpose for doing it. Because I want to see that you've engaged in those readings in a way that is more than just, true, false, multiple choice, fill in the blank, but in a robust way that you can now use them to answer the question. What I want you to get out of this exercise is a comprehensive view of our institutional situation. This isn't to say that I am going to pass you if you, say that the institutions are horrible and are going to fail, and I'm going to fail you if you say they're great and going to pass, or the opposite. Your analysis is what counts. I want to know that you're thinking about these issues. This is a hard question. Simple, but it's hard, and sometimes the hardest questions are kind of simple. But you have now been given the tools to deal with it. I think everything else is fairly well discussed in the assignment. However, if you are confused about anything, send me an email. If it is something that is relevant to the whole class, I will send out a reply to you, but then I will send out a general email to the class, kind of saying, a student asked this question, here's some general responses. Here's what you should look for, do, etc. A note, again, I've said this a couple of times on the assignment description, but people tend to get tied up on page numbers. So I put the 6 to 8 page uh, estimate in there, that again is just an estimate. However, I do not think you can accomplish what you need to do. Talk about concepts by at least 10 of our authors. And that doesn't mean you have to have a paragraph on each one, but a concept might refer to an author. But you can't do that in less than 6 pages. In fact, 6 pages might be kind of cutting it short as it is. But I don't want you going overboard. I don't want you writing a mission statement or a missive to be nailed to a church door or something like that. So try and keep it under 15 pages. I do understand if you go above the 8, I would have to go above the 8. But try and keep it succinct as possible. If it helps to envision your audience in a certain way, that's what the structure flexibility is for. But try and keep it succinct while still going into enough depth to show that you understand it. On another note, I've enjoyed this class. I have genuinely enjoyed reading your blog posts, probably more than I've been able to convey in the comments, and I'm going to have to figure out how to do that a little bit better as we move along semester to semester. But I have genuinely enjoyed it, and for those of you who have done the extra credit comments, you have added something to the blogging experience, both for yourself and for your classmates, that I don't know if you fully appreciate. It's quite a joy when I go to grade these blog posts and I see that there's been a back and forth discussion on something. Ultimately, that's what a lot of professors use the discussion boards for. But discussion boards don't give us a lot of freedom about content, and they don't really create community the way that I envision that. And yet I've seen some of you doing that on the blogs in kind of new and inventive ways, and I want to thank you for that. If you have any questions about advising or where to go from here, or you're graduating and you want to figure out what to do next, or maybe you just want to think about what classes you want to take in the future, send me an email. We'll get something set up either in person or we'll discuss it via email. I am here to help you succeed, and you guys have given me the joy of presenting this class yet again in a new format this time that I think is definitely a worthwhile format. I hope that you'll follow me on Twitter and keep me up to date with your lives if you're moving on. And if you're not, I hope to see you in class again soon. Thanks, take care, and email me with any questions.